クラスに可愛い子いっぱいいるでしょ。
Some stories don't end when time passes. They wait, quietly, for the moment they return. She thought the past was behind her, until one familiar face walked back into her life.
おばさん、お久しぶりです。
Not as a memory, but as part of her family.
コータ二人してどうしたの？
What happens when old feelings resurface in the wrong place? And silence becomes the most dangerous choice?
ミキにはこのこと内緒にしといてあげるから。もう寝ましょう。
This is not a story about love. It's a story about boundaries. And the moment a single decision changes everything.
俺、冬香さんのこと好きなんです。
Have you ever been certain that a chapter of your life was closed only to discover it waiting quietly for you, years later, in the most unexpected place? Not as a memory, not as a regret, but standing right in front of you, asking to be acknowledged. Yuka believed she understood her own story. She was not someone haunted by unfinished emotions or unresolved choices. Years ago, when a classmate named Koda expressed his feelings for her, she responded with a calm honesty that felt appropriate for that stage of life. She did not reject him harshly, nor did she invite ambiguity. She simply placed the moment where it belonged inside youth, inside a time that passes. And then she moved on, as most of us do, trusting that time would take care of the rest. Life unfolded quietly after that. Responsibilities replaced possibilities. Familiar routines replaced unanswered questions. Yuka grew into a version of herself that valued stability, clarity, and emotional order. She was not someone who lived in the past. Or so she thought. Then one day, her younger sister returned home with someone important to her. A boyfriend. A person she wanted to introduce to the family. When the door opened, Yuka felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not excitement, not fear, but a sudden stillness. The kind that happens when the mind needs a second longer than usual to understand what the eyes are seeing. It was Koda.
おばさん、お久しぶりです。
Time had reshaped him, as it reshapes everyone. He stood there confidently, naturally, as if the years between them had been nothing more than a pause. And yet, in that brief moment, Yuka felt the quiet collision of two timelines, who she had been and who she had chosen to become. What followed was polite, almost ordinary. The three of them spoke about everyday things, work, schedules, small observations that fill the air when people want everything to feel normal. No one mentioned the past. No one needed to. Silence, in moments like this, can feel like mutual understanding or avoidance. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. But psychology teaches us something important here. Unspoken experiences do not disappear simply because we refuse to name them. They wait, they observe. And when circumstances allow, they gently resurface, not to cause harm, but to ask a question we once postponed. For Yuka, this was not a story about rekindled feelings. It was a story about boundaries being tested not by desire, but by memory. About what happens when emotional history unexpectedly enters the present and asks whether clarity is still possible. And as the evening continued, it became clear that this encounter was not just coincidence. It was an invitation, not to return to the past, but to decide, consciously, how much power the past should be allowed to hold. There is a particular kind of tension that doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't raise voices or create scenes. Instead, it settles quietly between people, growing heavier the more it is ignored. For Fuyuka, that tension began after the door closed behind her sister and Koda that evening. Nothing inappropriate had happened. No rules had been crossed. And yet, something inside her remained unsettled, not because of what was said, but because of what lingered unsaid. Koda, on the other hand, was navigating a more complicated inner landscape. When he had confessed his feelings years ago, he had done so at a time when emotions were simple and consequences felt distant. Being refused had been disappointing, but not damaging. Life continued. He grew, adapted, and eventually formed a relationship with Fuyuka's sister one that was genuine and rooted in the present. And yet, encountering Fuyuka again stirred something he had assumed was already settled. Koda found himself referencing shared memories, small comments, gentle nostalgia, nothing overt, but enough to create emotional ambiguity. Fuyuka recognized this immediately, and rather than reacting with discomfort or accusation, she chose clarity. She addressed the situation calmly, stating without defensiveness that the past belonged where it was and that the present required respect. This was not a rejection of Koda as a person, but a reinforcement of her values. Koda expressed regret, not in the sense of asking for something more, but in acknowledging that memories can sometimes resurface unexpectedly. This admission did not make him wrong. It made him human.
ミキにはこのこと内緒にしといてあげるから。もう寝ましょう。
What makes the story compelling is not the presence of temptation, but the absence of dramatization. No one sought to hurt anyone else, and yet pain was still possible, especially for Fuyuka's sister, who remained unaware of the emotional complexity unfolding quietly around her. She understood that silence, while comfortable, could become harmful, not because truth needed to be confessed, but because boundaries needed to be protected. Fuyuka began to realize that the true challenge was not managing Koda's emotions, nor suppressing her own past, but choosing whether to intervene before ambiguity became misunderstanding. And that decision, subtle as it seemed, carried far more weight than any dramatic confrontation ever could.
冬香さん、僕のこと避けてますよね。
The moment of realization did not arrive through an argument or an emotional outburst. It came quietly, the way meaningful decisions often do. Fuyuka chose to speak to Koda directly, not in secrecy, not in heightened emotion, but with deliberate calm. She did not accuse him of wrongdoing, nor did she dramatize the past. Instead, she acknowledged it briefly, then placed it firmly where it belonged.
コータ二人してどうしたの？
She spoke about respect, not as a demand, but as a shared responsibility. Respect for the present, respect for her sister's trust, respect for the people they had all become since those earlier years. This conversation marked the emotional climax of the story, not because it was intense, but because it was honest. Koda listened, truly listened, and in doing so, he was forced to confront something uncomfortable yet essential. That revisiting old emotional narratives can unintentionally undermine the very relationships we value most. And so, something shifted. Not dramatically, not publicly, but internally. Kota accepted responsibility, not in guilt, but in resolve. He adjusted his behavior, reaffirmed his commitment to the present relationship in his life, and respected the boundary that Fuyuka had clearly drawn. No one was positioned as a villain. There was no betrayal to expose, no conflict to escalate. Instead, there was accountability without shame, and honesty without cruelty. For Fuyuka, the relief did not come from winning the situation, but from knowing she had acted in alignment with her values. She had chosen clarity over comfort, responsibility over avoidance. And in doing so, she protected something fragile, yet deeply important: the emotional safety of her sister and the integrity of the relationships around her. The climax of this story, then, is not a turning point filled with noise, but one defined by restraint. A reminder that sometimes the most powerful decisions are made not in moments of passion, but in moments of quiet moral courage. Boundaries are not walls, they are bridges. When clearly expressed, they create safety, not distance. They allow relationships to continue in healthy ways rather than deteriorate silently. Fuyuka's decision did not end connections. It stabilized them. This story does not ask us to judge its characters. Instead, it invites empathy. It reminds us that maturity is rarely loud. It often looks like calm conversations, thoughtful restraint, and choosing long-term well-being over momentary ease. And perhaps that is the most enduring lesson. Doing the right thing does not always feel dramatic or heroic. Sometimes it simply feels quiet. And that quiet, when guided by awareness and respect, is what keeps the most important parts of our lives intact. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect, then like the video. Subscribe for more thoughtful stories, and share it with someone who might need it. Thanks for watching.